Welcome back to Behind the Play. My name is Alex Adams, and today I'm very excited to introduce Jay Onrait, the host of SportsCentre on TSN. Jay, not to make you feel too old, but you were part of my morning routine all my childhood and still to this day. So thanks so much for taking the time and coming on.
It's my pleasure, and it's okay. I get that all the time these days that that people grew up with me. So I'm used to everyone making me feel old.
It's okay. I have gray hairs too, so we're one and the same. I'm heading there as well. I want to first ask you a bit about your career and for you, Jay, when did you first think you might want to pursue a career in sports journalism and media?
I started to watch, I kind of watched sports all through my life as a kid, but really it was probably around junior high, maybe when I was 14, 15, that I really started to love highlight shows specifically.
Okay.
It was an amazing era for highlight shows. It was the time of Chris Berman doing NFL primetime on Sunday nights, and we got that on TSN. CNN had its own highlight show at the time in the 80s. It was called CNN Sports Tonight, and it was so good. It was a half hour, just the concise rip through highlights. All the anchors were really polished and great. Fred Hickman and Nick Charles were kind of the famous ones. And then locally, we had Darren Detition hosting our version of Sportsline in Edmonton. So much like, people my age grew up with Jim Taddy and Mark Hebscher. I grew up with Dutchie. And, just watching all those guys, it just seemed like such a fun job, and specifically hosting a highlight show. I played a lot of sports in high school, so I didn't really have time to watch as many games as I would have liked. So the highlight shows at the time, sort of a pre-internet era, were kind of a lifeline, right? Because you had no other way to get the highlights. So I loved those shows, and probably around junior high was when I sort of started to realize that was something I wanted to do, but I was still a little too chicken to actually go do it right away out of high school. So I went into pre-pharmacy. My family had a pharmacy. So I went into pre-pharmacy out of high school for 2 years. But after a year of it, I just knew it wasn't what I really wanted to do. And I read a book called What Color is Your Parachute? And it's still published today. It's a great book. It's a book for people who don't really know what they want to do with their life. And it helps you find out what exactly that might be. So I suspected I wanted to be a sportscaster. So in the book, it suggests that if there's something you want to do in life, you should go talk to someone who's already doing that thing and ask them about it, try to find out about the job, find out what it's all about, and see if, it really is the job for you. And then in the process of talking to a person like that, you make your first contact in the industry, right? So that's exactly what I did. I went and spoke with, I went to the local broadcasting school in Edmonton, Nate, and they suggested I go talk to a young producer at Global in Edmonton named Pat Kiernan. He was in his 20s, and he was already producing the 10 o'clock news and doing a money segment. And he was great. I was going to U of A, I was taking sciences, and I asked if I could meet him for coffee, and he said, sure. And I said, I want to get into the biz. He said, you can come in and hang out in the newsroom anytime you want. He said, I can't pay you, but if you want to come in, I can teach you how to write news. I could teach you, all about how a television newsroom works. And that's exactly what I did. So for my second year at U of A, I was there all the time. And I just fell in love with it. And specifically, I saw, Dutchie, who was working still in the sports department at the time. And, it just looked like he was having so much fun. And it just, got me even more excited about the possibility of going into broadcasting. So I applied to get into Ryerson, and miraculously I got in. And I was in radio and television arts, and it all kind of took off from there.
And with that, obviously, you went to TSN and you've been hosting SportsCentre for so long. Maybe just tell us a little bit about when you got started at doing SportsCentre, what kind of your process was like, and what is it to this day, and what do you try to bring to SportsCentre that made you so successful?
Well, what's funny is, I think a lot of people think that, I started doing the show and I was, always kind of like, cracking jokes and loose, but it was totally the opposite. I was wound tight as a drum. I did the show pretty straightforward at first, and sort of my personality came out gradually, and that's really the way when people ask me now, how do you become better at being on air? I always say it's very simple. It's reps. It's like anything in life. You just have to do it over and over. So when I started, I was a bit nervous. I was lucky enough. My first on-air job was at Global in Saskatoon, and at the time they still had a half-hour highlight show after the late news called Sportsline, which we had here too in Toronto, and it was incredible for me right out of school because you're doing a half-hour highlight show every night. You're getting those reps that you need. So it was a great starting point for me. And then by the time I got to TSN, it was a lot more comfortable. And I was lucky because my boss, I had worked at TSN behind the scenes while going to Ryerson. I lucked into an internship, and then they kept me around. So for my third and fourth year at Ryerson, I worked at TSN as a freelancer. It was just great. And while I was there, the producer of the 6 o'clock Sports Center, we hit it off. And when I returned to TSN as an anchor, he was running TSN. So it was very fortuitous for me because, he was someone who trusted me and would allow me to have a little bit of rope to experiment and try new things. And that's exactly what I did. And so then I got paired up with Dan, and we just had very similar sensibilities about, what kind of show we wanted to do. We wanted to do a show that felt like you were just hanging out with your buddies, and it was very casual, different than other sportscasts, that were a bit more formal. And it just worked, and again, it was really because we had a boss who believed in us and really liked us. And his philosophy was very simple. He said that, I'm going to put you guys on the late night show, and then it's going to loop all morning. And so kids are going to grow up with you. And then when they go away to college, then they're going to watch you at night after they get home from the bars. And he was absolutely right. It all happened exactly as he said it would. And it's a big reason why we were so successful, that he had that foresight to know that that was a perfect time slot for us. Even to the point that when we returned to TSN after being in Los Angeles for a few years, they basically offered us any time slot we wanted.
Wow.
And we just said, let's go back to the old time slot because that's where people like to see us. And if we're on during the day, maybe our lives are a little easier, we don't have to work the late nights, but at the same time, I don't think that many people would have seen us. So, it's just turned out to be a really great fit for us and a great fit for me now doing the show solo to, have this sort of late night audience that stuck with us all these years, and then this early morning audience that's kind of grown up with us.
And with that, how do you prepare for a late night show? Because especially like SportsCentre, where you need to know so many sports and it's essentially daily, like how do you prepare for a show? Give us a little bit of an insight into maybe a day in the life of Jay behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. I mean, I'm lucky. One of the things I did when I was behind the scenes at TSN is I was a highlight writer. And so, every night I'd write 2 different sets of highlights for 2 games. And there's a bunch of us who did the same thing. And those highlight scripts are pretty basic. They're very meat and potato scripts, kind of getting you from A to B. So I have a lot of great writers who help me in that sense. The sort of personality comes out when I ad-lib off of those scripts, So, but in terms of preparation, it's really just, keeping up with sports in any capacity throughout the day, whether it's Twitter, whether it's sports radio, whether it's podcasts, and just being on top of it. And then at about 5 o'clock, my crew and I, my producer, me, and our whole crew, we have a meeting. And we go over, what's going to be on the show tonight, who our guests will be, what will be leading the show, what sports are happening that night. So, just so I have an idea, where we're at. And then a couple hours later, I get into work because that meeting is over the phone. and get makeup, head in, and start writing my on cam. So everything in terms of me being on camera is written by me. It always has been, and I imagine it always will be. And so I write the show, and then it's a series of interviews for me right now. So, since Dan left, the show has become very interview heavy. And so that's changed sort of the approach a little bit in that, I'll get questions from a producer, sort of suggested questions, and I can go off those questions, or I can just ad lib and do what I want. And I like a little bit of a mix of both. I find if a producer puts together a good list of questions, sometimes it's just as simple as that to go with those questions, and they're well researched. But I often find that there's one or two questions I want to throw in myself just as you go through the process of doing the interview. And so we probably pre-tape 3 or 4 interviews before the show, and then we'll go live at midnight, and we'll start ripping through the show. And some of it'll be on tape, some of it'll be live, and then at 1 o'clock, assuming everything is done and okay, then we're out of there. So it's much better than it used to be. Dan and I, when we started, did the show from 2 to 3 a.m.
Wow.
And it was, in hindsight, I still can't believe we did the show that late, but
that's crazy.
That's when we did it, and we did it that way for a long time. So doing it from 12 to 1 now feels like a dream, basically. It's great.
I want to go off kind of you've been known for being so funny. I don't want to imitate you, but BOBROVSKY and Canadian and all that that you've brought to the broadcast. For that, how much of that is ad lib for you, and kind of do you work on jokes? I know you did stand up or I think a little bit as a younger person. So just maybe tell us about the behind the scenes and how you try to bring the humor to the broadcast.
Yeah, it's all ad libbed. All that stuff is ad libbed, and it's picking your spots, right? It's not, as my old boss used to say, it's not the ha ha ha. It's not a comedy club, so the whole show can't just be us ripping jokes. But I found when we started, Dan and I, that it was like we would push it a little bit, try to add more and more jokes. Our boss would be like, dial it back a little bit. And we almost it was like we were almost workshopping how we wanted to do the show long term. And eventually we found like a nice mix, like a nice mix of jokes and a nice mix of serious information. But for the most part, all the jokes are ad libbed. And it's all, everything kind of has a purpose. Like the Canadian thing is something that my friends and I used to do when we were in high school.
Huh.
And so if it would be, and it wouldn't just be an athlete, like it would be a Canadian actor or something in a movie, we'd just be like, oh, Michael J. Fox, Canadian, like that. Like, so that's kind of where that comes from. And all the jokes kind of come from places like that, either it's my past or something as simple as the fact that I thought BOBROVSKY just sounded like the name of a renegade cop in a 1970s TV show who had gone rogue and had to be reined back in by his tough but well-meaning sergeant. So somehow that turned out to be just a huge hit for whatever reason, and people loved it. So yeah, it's really all about just allowing my personality to come out and just be who I am, and also embracing the mistakes too. The whole "you blew it" thing that we do at the end of the show stemmed from the fact that we were doing the show so late, from 2 to 3 in the morning. And if we made mistakes, which we always did, we'd have to go back and fix them before the morning show ran, right? So we would be keeping the crew later, and we just sort of were like, at some point we were like, listen, we're not perfect broadcasters, we're never going to be. Why don't we just, instead of correcting all these mistakes, why don't we just write them down, and at the end of the show confess to them like we're in confession or something. And it just, people like that too. And I think the angle, especially that people like, is that, and that we maybe brought to the table is that sort of idea that you're not going to be a perfect broadcaster. Everything was so polished in the 70s and 80s and even the 90s, and we're just not those people. And it used to frustrate me. I used to get upset if I would make mistakes because I hated to let the crew down and stuff. And now I'm just like, whatever.
Yeah.
Got to embrace it. No one's perfect. Life's not perfect. So, it's funny how that, went from something that we just decided to do so we could get out of there early to being one of the most popular things we do on the show.
How do you draw the line, especially with your comedy, where you might go over it? I know you have a Merrick Malik story where he got upset at you for saying something from your book, which everyone should check out. I've really been loving your book. But how do you draw that line on the sports, on the broadcast with your jokes as well?
Yeah, I think there's so many things you got to be careful about. Nothing about anyone's appearance, never anything about, never making fun of kids in any capacity. There's just basic lines you don't cross. And even with athletes in general, I try not to make fun of anybody. I try to make sure that if the joke is on anyone, it's on me.
Okay.
And I'm the one taking the brunt of it. But I think the line, after doing this type of thing for 25 years, I kind of know where the line is now, and I know where I have to pull back a little bit and where I can hit the gas pedal a little bit. So stuff like, the Gary Bettmans of the world, NHL team owners, just fat cats, right? Like guys who deserve to have their be poked and prodded a little bit. They're, to me, they're fair game, but in general, I probably try to joke about athletes a lot less, especially after the Merrick Malik incident.
I want to, you described it a little bit, but what advice would you give to people in trying to go into the sports media industry, in your opinion, Jay?
It's hard right now. It's so hard. I've been, we had layoffs last week at our network, and it's funny that you asked me that, Alex, because a lot of people have at our network who are still around, those of us who are still around, have really been talking about that. When young people ask us what, advice like you just asked me, it's getting harder and harder for me to recommend it as a career profession because it's so volatile now. And it's not going to change, unfortunately. The belt tightening never seems to stop. And, it's a constant sort of thing where the product, it feels like, in my opinion, it suffers because so many good people are being let go, so many experienced people. The people we lost last week were all 20, 30-year veterans of the industry, not new people, right? So, I think from a parent company perspective, they just see a number, but these people are super valuable to us. So that's a long-winded way of me saying I would never discourage anyone from pursuing their dream, of course. I really, and this business has obviously been great for me. But I do have a hard time, fully recommending this industry to people at this point, just because of the volatility. It's a sad situation, but it's just more, it's just the reality, unfortunately.
I want to go from that to a high note, and I want to also flip this podcast a little bit from your show where you interview people about their sports opinions. So I want to ask you a little bit about your own. And the first one is a fun little question. And for you, Jay, if you were Gary Bettman for one day, what rule would you change?
Well, the first thing I would do is move the Arizona Coyotes to Houston. Or Kansas City. I would not implement any rule changes before I immediately moved that franchise out of that market, because it's just bewildering to me that the other owners haven't squeezed Gary and told him enough's enough, especially after this recent vote in Tempe that voted down a new arena. Rule changes, that's a great question. In the NHL, I'd have to think about that a little bit, but I generally like the way the game is right now. I don't have too much of a problem with it. And I even don't hate the shootout. I know some people would be like, well, I get rid of the shootout, but I think the problem is, and the reason the shootout works in the NHL and the reason it works in soccer is that in the end, it's a definitive way to determine a winner in a short period of time. And when it comes to, one thing I might say is I might change the start times of games a little bit. Like I might start to insist that teams start games at 7 o'clock local, and no more 7:30s, definitely no 8 locals. It's just too late for kids. Like it's, not just to go to the games, but to watch at home. And I feel like you're going to lose a generation of kids here who just aren't going to be able to stay up late enough to watch a whole game, right? So my daughter loves watching games, and it's always like, okay, you can watch the first 2 periods. And she's always like, well, then what good is that? I'm not even going to find out who's winning.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that might be the one thing I would change, is that I would start to insist on 7 p.m. local starts and absolutely no later than that.
And I want to go to Toronto and the Leafs because they've had a crazy offseason. They have a lot of things they have to clear up this offseason. What do you make of the Leafs going into next year? And would you keep the Core-4 if you were Brad Shiliving?
Well, I think, first of all, I think that was a really great hire for the Leafs. I think I know a lot of Leafs Nation was, I don't know if the word underwhelmed is probably the word I would use, seemed to be underwhelmed by it. But to me, he's a rock solid GM. He's liked by everybody in the industry. And quite frankly, last summer when Johnny Gaudreau and Matthew Tkachuk both decided to leave Calgary, I thought he did incredibly well, considering he was backed into a corner. So, I think they've got a great GM there. And would I keep the Core-4 together? No. But at the same time, I could see a scenario, or I feel like the more likely scenario is that they will be kept together for at least the first part of this year, because I think for Brad, he really wants to get an assessment of what exactly he has with this team before making any sudden rash movements. And he alluded to that in his press conference when he was hired, right? He said, I'm not going to, it looks, headlines are great and it looks good, but at the end, it's tough to find talent, and the Core-4 it's all about talent. Does it work together, and is it a Stanley Cup winning team? Maybe it's not, but maybe you wait and maybe you assess maybe down the road if there's something out there for you. But I could see a scenario where, like a Mitch, to me, Marner is the most likely trade chip. You'd love to trade. I know everyone says you'd love to trade Tavares, but I think he's been sensational. He's had great years with the Leafs. He's just, he's not as young as the other guys, and I get that. He's not as fast as the other guys, but I mean, the numbers are still pretty impressive. So yeah, I would probably trade Marner. I think you get the most return for him, and I think, in the postseason, it's tougher for smaller players like that. I just think it is. I think they could use a stud defenseman, so if you could do a Marner for Brett Pesce type swap, I think it would be, in my opinion, that would be hard to turn down. But I know a lot of teams would love to have a Brett Pesce, so who knows? I guess we'll see.
And I want to go to the Sens because I'm here in Ottawa, and they had a chaotic sale. Maybe just what do you make of them finally having new ownership that seems sustainable, and maybe how bright do you think the future is in Ottawa?
I think the future is absolutely golden for this team because, quite frankly, it seemed like Eugene Melnyk, while he was alive, he was absolutely never going to sell this team. And he was just, God rest his soul. I don't like to speak ill of the dead, of course, but he was running it into the ground in a lot of ways. He was alienating. The fact that Daniel Alfredsson lives in the city of Ottawa and was not involved with the team in any capacity was just bewildering to me, how that could even possibly be. The greatest player in the history of your franchise. And it's not like he moved back to Sweden. He stayed in Ottawa, raised his kids there. Like, he should be the president of the team. End of story, right? Like, it's baffling, right? And it's baffling that Melnyk didn't try to mend the fences. Obviously, Alfredsson was really upset about how it ended contract-wise as a player, and I don't blame him one bit. But, at some point, you got to try to mend that fence, right, if you're Eugene, and he just didn't do that. So, to me, one of the best things about Andlauer coming in is that now this opens the door for Alfredson to come back, for Wade Redden, for Chris Phillips, for all these guys to be involved. And for a fan base like Ottawa, there's just a warm, fuzzy feeling, when great players are back and involved in the team in some way. And then, there's lots to talk about. I think Pierre Dorian's done a terrific job, but seems like, maybe his time is up for whatever reason. So, if they go out and hire someone like a Steve Staios, I think that's terrific. But, I love the players they have now. I love the enthusiasm they have. The fan base deserves so much better. And so now just to have that financial stability, and hopefully this will lead to a brand new arena downtown. Man, it's exciting. It's got to be so exciting to be a Sens fan, because even when Mr. Melnick passed away, I know his daughters initially said they wanted to keep the team, and I thought, well, maybe that'll be a bit better, but I do think this is a much, much better scenario to have Andlauer in there, someone that, understands ownership. He was a part, minority owner of the Habs. And so, this is nothing about this is new to him. And yeah, I just think it's got to be a very exciting time to be a Senators fan right now.
It definitely is, and I can't wait for next year to start, and we'll see with DeBrincat, but it'll be definitely a fun year next year, and hopefully they make the playoffs. You've asked, I feel like every analyst on TSN about Pierre-Luc Dubois, so I want to ask you, what do you make of Pierre-Luc Dubois like this offseason? Do you think he goes to the Habs? What do you think happens there with Pierre-Luc? Where do you think he goes? Because it seems as though he's definitely done in Winnipeg.
Yeah, that was sort of the consensus for the last 2 years, that he wanted to go to Montreal. But, sort of the recent reports are that other teams are being very aggressive in trying to pursue him. And the LA Kings keep getting mentioned as one of those teams. And, yes, he apparently wants to go to Montreal, but it would be hard for me to believe that if he got traded to LA, he would have that hard of a time with it. They're a really good team. They definitely have the assets to trade to Winnipeg to get him. So I could absolutely see him there. And it's okay. It is what it is. Winnipeg, it's the hardest GM job in the league, right? Nobody wants to play there, apparently. Everybody's got, and that's every Canadian team, by the way. Like every Canadian team, one thing that's going to come out over the last year is that basically every Canadian team except for Toronto, and in a lot of cases, Toronto included, they're on most players' no trade lists, right? And so it's hard, man. Like, if you're Kevin Cheveldayoff and you're like, okay, I want this player for Dubois, and Rob Blake says, you know what, I would do that, but he's got a no trade and you're on the list. Like, it's horrible, right? It's not a level playing field is what it is. It's just not a level playing field. So that's what makes the fact that, Cheveldayoff has done as good a job as he has quite remarkable. But yeah, I could easily see him going to LA. I could see Blake Wheeler being bought out. And I think that's a likely scenario. Connor Hellebuyck, I think, teams are questioning whether they want to sign him for $9.5 million, but I truly believe a team will step up and pick him up, because he's one of the maybe three difference-making, one of the goalies in the league that legitimately can steal games, right? And so, to me, it's crazy that you would be put off by contract demands, knowing that this guy, last year he flat out kept Winnipeg in it right until the end. So, and then Mark Scheifele's the wild card, but it seems like he's likely on the way out as well. So yeah, it's going to be a very interesting off season in Winnipeg. But Kevin Cheveldayoff's very meticulous and doesn't allow himself to be pushed into things he doesn't want to do, right? So who knows? Maybe some of those guys will still be with the team when the fall comes around, whether they like it or not.
Before I let you go, I just want to ask you kind of a bigger hockey question about the Stanley Cup Finals. Obviously, Vegas won, but in your mind, how good is it for the NHL and really for hockey in general that it was two non-traditional markets in Vegas and Panthers in the finals? And I think they had maybe the lowest ratings in a long time.
Yeah, I don't think it was great. I mean, if you're asking how good is it for the league, how good is it for hockey? I mean, the ratings bore it out, right? Like, and that's the thing. I think Gary Bettman's hell-bent on keeping the Coyotes in Arizona for one simple reason, and I understand what the reason is, and it's that it's one of the fastest-growing cities in the United States, maybe the fastest-growing city, and one of the biggest media markets in the United States. But the problem is it's not a hockey market. So you can have an NHL team in Tokyo, the biggest city on the planet, right? But if there aren't enough hockey fans there, they're not going to watch the hockey, right? So I get the market size argument, but at some point you have to decide what's a hockey market and what's not a hockey market. And, Vegas, Florida, these are, I don't know what the right word would be to describe them, but when we lived in Los Angeles, LA has more history of the hockey market than a lot of American cities do. And the year we moved there, the Kings won the cup.
Yeah.
And I would listen to local sports radio in LA, and all the hosts would say, all right, I guess we got to learn who all the Kings are now. Like, nobody
Wow.
in LA, I mean, nobody is talking about the LA Kings on sports radio, around the water cooler. No one, except for the 17,000 people who go to the games. And they do. They fill the building. They have a great fan base. The Kings have a great fan base. But it's just the people going to those games and watching on TV. And their ratings this past year for TV were about 30,000 a game.
Wow.
So,
wow.
My point is that that's a good market. And that's a better market than Vegas. That's a better market than Florida. And they still struggle to get attention in their own market in a city where the Lakers are the Kings, the Dodgers are the other Kings, everybody else is whatever, and that's just the way it is, and that's the way it's always going to be. And so I think that's the struggle for the NHLs. I didn't realize until I moved to the States how truly marginal a sport it is down there. Yes, it's one of the four major sports on paper, but the reality is none of those debate shows on ESPN or FS1 are ever talking hockey. And even ESPN, who got the hockey broadcast rights back last year, when they started, suddenly there were hockey highlights on SportsCentre down there, and they were talking hockey, and I was like, wow, okay. And this year, that's fallen right off the cliff, right? Like that's it, because I get it. Like their viewers aren't craving
hockey,
Minnesota Wild, Columbus Blue Jackets highlights in January. They want to talk about the NFL at that point, right? So that's the eternal struggle that hockey will face. And I know the league continues to make billions, and that's why Gary's been around so long, is he's made those owners so much money and made them richer than they already are. But has he really grown the game? I would question that argument personally.
Well, Jay, thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. I just want to give you the floor. Is there anything at SportsCentre or at TSN that you want to plug that people should watch out for?
Well, still doing the show every night, midnight Eastern on TSN, and it's looping every morning. So if you haven't watched this for a while, tune in. You might like what you see. Well,
thank you so much, Jay. I definitely watch it as much as I can, and I really appreciate you taking the time today, and excited for what's next to come for you and the show.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me, and all the best to you in the future.
Thanks so much, Jay. I really appreciate it.